Hello, welcome to the second part of our Bible study series on the splendor of the Old Testament. Today we're going to be talking about what in Christian Bibles are considered to be the historical books. In Jewish Bibles or the Tanakh, they always talk about, or the next section of the Bible for them are the prophetic books. And actually many of the books we refer to as historical books, they put in the prophetic books. So the order of these books are not different, but we just call them something different. And then, of course, some of our prophetic books are also included in the prophetic books. Now, what Christians call the prophetic books, are the historical books, are the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, the book of Ruth, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, and 1 and 2 Chronicles. And although they are called historical, as always, history is written by the winners, and they are not journalistic, perhaps as we consider journalism. But even in our journalism, everything is not precise. Everything has their spin. And all of this is always true. So sometimes people look at it and say, well, it might not be literal. It's not necessarily, everything is not necessarily literal, even in journalism. So these are the historical books, and especially in the book of Joshua. And Joshua, as we might remember, is the successor to Moses, and he is the one who brings the Israelites from the wilderness into the promised land to settle them in the promised land. And in this settlement, in this settling, I should say, it is depicted in the book of Joshua as conquest, as God helping with these mighty deeds of kicking out these other people and allowing the Israelites to be presented with the promised land. However, archaeology has shown us that this isn't really the way it happened, that the Israelites settled into the promised land very quietly, very gently. They simply came and intermarried with the people of Canaan who were already there. And this is actually much more comforting to people who think, oh, the Bible is so violent and awful. And that is because of when we get into the book of Samuel, which we'll talk about in a little bit, we have a monarchy, we have King David. And of course, King David is the culmination of this macho, strong, military, God-inspired force that brought the Israelites into the promised land and ultimately created this great kingdom led by the best king ever, the most macho man who has ever lived, David. And of course he couldn't come from these nice sheep herding, goat herding people who met these other nice people and lived next to them and intermarried with them, and oh, what a sweet story. And then David comes and starts killing people. Well, that just doesn't sound right. So, interestingly enough, in the story of Jericho, one of the most famous stories we have, most people remember how everyone came and marched 7 times around the walls of Jericho and blew the priest blew the shofar, the ram's horns, and the walls came tumbling down. and then generally most of our stories forget that they went in and slaughtered everyone, it's a liturgical event. This is calling upon God. People are carrying the Ark of the Covenant. The priests are the ones circling the city in the divine number of perfection, 7. The shofar, the ram's horn that recalls the ram that Abraham sacrificed on Mount Moriah. All of these things are liturgical. This is a worshiping act. It's not really an act of destruction. It's not really a warlike act. So it's very, very interesting how that transpires. And so everything that follows in the book of Joshua really are not to be taken so much as we're beating up these people and beating up those people, but almost as this is the way God wants us to act. And unfortunately, it's in the book of Joshua that we hear of probably the most disturbing event that can happen in wartime, and that's known as the ban. And the ban is when a commander, usually at the behest of God, orders the soldiers to slaughter everyone in a city, man, woman, child, burn the city to the ground. Usually the full ban means you slaughter the livestock, slaughter everything, the flocks in the field, and not even take spoils for yourself or even to sacrifice to God, nothing. Just burn it to the ground and everything with it. And that is incredibly disturbing. And the fact that God is usually considered to be the one ordering this, there's a passage in the book of Samuel that is considered one of the most disturbing passages in the Bible because specifically God orders this. People were like, God, how could God order this kind of slaughter? And again, we have to take into account this is people interpreting God. Just like God doesn't call down tornadoes on people or the death of a child or anything like that, a fire that burns down whole cities, right? Did God cause the fires that destroyed Paradise, the city of Paradise? Of course not. Same type of thing. God doesn't call down war atrocities, genocide, nothing like that. God doesn't order it. But in the ancient Near East, especially in the times of Joshua and the time of Samuel, we have to understand there would be 2 reasons for slaughtering everyone in a town. One would be these people lived at subsistence levels. The Israelites and whoever they were attacking barely had enough food for themselves. Actually, I'm going to say 3 things, sorry. So one of them is you're barely at a subsistence level. So you do not have any sort of ability to have prisoners of war. And therefore there would be no ability for prisoner exchange. You would have, if you kept anyone alive, if you kept, say, take women as slaves, those women are going to raise up children who will come and slaughter you in your beds at night. And if you think, oh, that didn't really happen, I'll give you a good example. Genghis Khan. In his place and time, Mongolia, they generally, the tribal warfare that happened there, the clan warfare that happened there, the general rule was you killed everyone, man, woman, and child, unless a child was not taller than a wagon wheel, because then they figured the child was too young to remember that their whole family was slaughtered. Unfortunately for those people, Genghis Khan was very short for his age. So he was actually about 4, but he was shorter than a wagon wheel. So they let him live. Worst mistake they ever made, because by the time he was a powerful warlord himself, before he became the great emperor, but by the time he was a powerful warlord himself, he hunted down every single person who belonged to the tribe that slaughtered his family, and he had no mercy. It didn't matter if the kid was smaller than a wagon wheel. He got rid of them all. He was 4. But he never forgot. This happened. This was the type of thing the Israelites tried to avoid by slaughtering everyone in the city. Now, in terms of why didn't you keep the spoils of war, you didn't keep the spoils of war because that led to conflict within your tribe, right? That's my cow. No, that's my cow. That gold bracelet is mine. No, that I saw that first. Again, you have conflict within your tribe. Even if you left, say, women and children alive for slaves, or women alive, young girls who would be slaves in your household that later you could marry or whatever, or she seemed strong, whatever. Again, even if you felt they were too young to raise up sons against you, it was still, again, this conflict within your tribe. So you had no choice. You had to kill them all to protect yourselves. And it's awful and it's terrible, but they did the same thing back to the Israelites. If you didn't flee, you didn't pick up your family and move to a new territory and hide, they slaughtered all of you for the same reasons. So the ban was not something new and different in those times. What the ban was really about was blaming God for something that made you feel really guilty. Really guilty. Because that's how a nice person, a nice guy, could hopefully keep the nightmares away. Right? God made me do it. God wanted this done. I didn't really do this. I didn't really murder that little baby or that pregnant woman or that little old man begging for mercy. No, that was God. That was God. I was doing God's will. And that's how some of these guys could sleep at night and justify it. And that's very human. Did God want them to do it? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. God doesn't want that kind of warfare. God doesn't want war at all. But those were the times. That's how people were in that place, in that time. Blame it on God. Nowadays, what people want to say, the devil made me do it. There, God made me do it. Kill the heathens. You know? People try to justify horrible actions that they can't face having done. So we have to remember that when we read these passages. Just because it says God ordered this doesn't mean God really did. It means that's how people tried to understand their own behavior and tried to justify it and tried to help themselves live with it. And so the book of Joshua ends with the people having settled in the land of Canaan. And it talks about which tribes get which land, which territories, and how they complained. Why did they get that land? Why did we not get enough? Typical. No one likes to share in the sandbox. And the only tribe that does not get land is the tribe of Levi, because the Levites are the priests and everyone is obligated to take care of them because they're the priests. They come and where the tabernacle is, they celebrate the feast, they perform sacrifice, they perform these sacred duties that no one else can. And therefore, it is the responsibility of everyone to take care of them. Now, the book of Judges reveals how these agreements fall apart. And the time of the judges, with the exception of Deborah, the judges did not really act like judges today. They didn't settle court cases. They didn't determine guilt or innocence or impose sentences on people. Deborah did. She sat under a tree and people came to her for judgment. But otherwise, they were heroic military leaders who rose up and were risen up by God. They were very charismatic. They were very strong military leaders to defend one or the other of the tribes who was under assault by some enemy. It was generally the Philistines. And then when other tribes didn't want to help, right? Oh no, the people of the tribe of Reuben, the Philistines are attacking, help us. And people would kind of go, And then Samson would come forth and what a great he-man and hero and judge. He would be called a judge. Samson's coming. Okay, we'll rally to Samson because he killed 50,000 Philistines with one leg bone or whatever of an animal. Oh, okay. And he's one of the most famous judges. Gideon is a famous judge. Jephthah is a famous judge. And Deborah is a famous judge. And they all led Israelites into battle and saved the day and got all the other tribes to help out whomever was being attacked. And this system worked until it didn't. And then at the end of the book of Judges, and if you are a sensitive person, if you've had trauma, certain kinds of trauma, personal assault trauma, do not read the end of the book of Judges. Do not read chapter 19 to the end of the book of Judges. It will trigger you. It's very horrific. It's very symbolic, but it's symbolic of the fact that relationships between the tribes degenerated to the point where atrocities occurred. And as soon as one particular atrocity occurred, all the tribes became enraged with the tribe of Benjamin where this atrocity occurred, and there was outright war between all the tribes. And at that point, that was the first time that people called out for a king. They said, this is it. We can't get along. We can't keep the peace, right? We can't even be civil. We can't even, right? People can't walk down the street safely in each other's tribal areas. This is the end of it. And it was an atrocity committed around a priest. And this is a priest. You're supposed to leave these people alone. This is the family of a priest. And So that even shows the religious nature of everything is going to hell in a handbasket. We need a king. We need a king. We need a king to solve these problems. So that was their first call for a king. And their second call for a king, when the prophet Samuel was there, was after the Battle of Ebenezer, when they lose a battle against the Philistines take a hold of the Ark of the Covenant, and the Israelites are beside themselves. They lost their most sacred possession, the Ark of the Covenant, and they're in despair. And of course, God takes care of the problem. Some of you have heard me mention this before, where God, our Bibles are sanitized for our protection. I think virtually every English translation says that they were afflicted with tumors, the Philistines, while they held on to the Ark of the Covenant. Yes, but where are those tumors located? Yes, they are hemorrhoid tumors, and this is an affliction. This is dreadful. The entire city of Philistines, everyone is afflicted with them, and they are most atrocious and most incurable. And finally, the priests say, put the Ark of the Covenant on a cart, on a donkey, smack the donkey on the rump, and point it towards Israelite territory, and then we'll get better. And indeed, that was so. And I love that story, not because God was yes, because it's hysterical and God was so creative. He didn't kill anyone, but boy, we wish we will die. But it shows that even if, right to all the Israelites, this was the most dreadful thing that could happen, God took care of it. God worked it out. And I have always, and if you read my notes from last week, you know, I really have a personal difficulty in trusting that God will work things out for me. And these stories, even the kind of funny ones and very creative ones, they're always those reminders to me that in God's own way and God's own time, I'll be all right. You know, and when I think I have made it this far, and I have the most wonderful husband on earth, I have great kids, I have wonderful friends, and I forget that all of that is from God, you know, and that I shouldn't just look at, well, God, you let all these bad things happen to me. Like the Israelites, you let us lose the Ark of the Covenant. Now we need, right, safety over rights, and not just trust in you. I mean, I could have gone very badly. My life could have turned out very badly. In many ways, if I had let it, if I had surrendered a lot for just safety. And instead, in many ways, it was because I did listen to God and went the way God wanted me to, when I really could have veered off the path and gone off the rails many a time. You know, I look at people on the streets, and I definitely am one of those people who it is absolutely true there, but for the grace of God. That could be me. I could have really gone off the rails, and it's the miracle of God that I have not. And so when I read these stories about God bailing out the Israelites again and again, I realize, yes, God works. God works weirdly behind the scenes sometimes, but God does have your back. Even if it is, right? We don't even know if the Israelites ever knew why the Philistines, or when they knew when the Philistines let them get the ark back, right? Maybe at the time they never knew, and it was just later in some other battle they captured someone and he talked, right? Or they caught a spy and they're like, why did we ever get that back? But at the time it was just miraculously, it came back. God does that miraculously. Things work out, it's and over and over and over again we see that. But instead of listening to Samuel, the prophet Samuel, who told them, if you get a king, this king will conscript your sons into his army, will make your daughters his slaves, in his kitchens, will make you tithe all the best fruits of your labor, your lambs, your vineyards, the best of your vineyards, and will enslave you. That's what you'll get. Whereas God is already taking care of you. And they chose safety over freedom, which people do to this day, again and again and again, right? You can look in every country in the world and people tend to do that hand over fist, right? Safety over freedom. And that can show up and be lack of trust in God. God keeps us safe. People we're not happy thinking how little control we have, but it's okay because there's God. God has our backs. Nevertheless, they demand a king. Ultimately, they get King David. And King David, I call him the Teflon king because nothing sticks. While he ends up creating the united monarchy, which everyone thinks is the best thing since sliced bread, he accomplishes this through defeating all the Israelites' enemies, the Philistines, the Ammonites, the Moabites, everyone, through coercion of some of the other tribes that are a little reluctant, through personal charm, and through marrying the daughter of everyone in sight. But it turns out that that's all he's good at, is war. He's one of those guys who's only good at war. And it specifically says in 1 Samuel, and in my notes I have the exact location, but it specifically says how at the time when kings go to war, David stayed home. And the time when kings go to war is in the summer, because they never fought war in the ancient Near East during the winter, which makes sense, right? You have rain, which obscures your vision, the roads are muddy, the fields are muddy, people can be too cold, freeze to death. They don't really have winter clothes for fighting in cold weather. Snow, everything's obscure, you can't even get to the battlefield, whatever. Just sort of, and there's not enough food, right? Everyone's too busy trying to find food to feed their families. It's just, traditionally, no one ever went to war in the winter. This carried on through the Middle Ages. They never fought wars in the winter. Hitler would have done well to remember that, although he thought he was being smart, right? Attacking Russia in this July, August. Never can predict when the Russian winter will come. It came early. But again, the point well taken, right? Don't fight in the winter, not a good idea. And so this would have been summertime. So either he's bored or it's hot in his castle and palace or whatever, and he's walking on the roof. Bathsheba is not bathing on her roof. She's bathing somewhere in her house, minding her own business, and he's being a peeping Tom. And he sees she's very beautiful. And in the Bible, there's nothing worse than being beautiful. Bad things happen to beautiful people in the Bible. Everyone who has ever been declared beautiful has had awful, awful things happen. We always think, oh, it's so good to be beautiful. I would love to be beautiful. How wonderful. No, the Bible teaches us bad things happen if you're beautiful. There's literally no one in the Bible who has been described as beautiful who did not have horrible things happen to them. Man, woman, doesn't matter. Bad things happen. So she has horrible things happen to her, but ultimately she becomes the mother of Solomon. And I think for many women, and probably men as well, their children is where they can find happiness if other parts of their lives are unhappy. They can find great joy in their children. And I think that ended up being very true for Bathsheba. She found great joy and happiness in Solomon. They seemed to have a very good relationship. She got him to be king. He wasn't the oldest son. And she obviously was this very tough woman who managed to thrive in a man's world, in a very difficult situation with very terrible traumatic events foisted upon her by men. And she really prospered. And you can see again why this kind of tough, intelligent, strong woman was an ancestress of Jesus. And so then after the book of Samuel, in the book of when we start getting into the book of Kings, then we start hearing about how the kingdom fell apart. And one of the big reasons the kingdom fell apart was Solomon. We always hear, oh, great, wise Solomon. Yeah, good propaganda. Because while he put the monarchy of Israel on the world stage, and indeed there even talks about how that mentions the kingdom of Israel. He was known for marrying the daughters of foreign kings everywhere, and even apparently married a daughter of Pharaoh, which was a very rare thing to happen. Generally, daughters of Pharaoh intermarried with their half-brothers. He apparently married a daughter of Pharaoh, although that probably meant Egypt was kind of weak. But still, that was a big coup, so to speak. However, he built them temples and apparently worshipped at those temples with them, which clearly would scandalize especially the pious among the Israelites. Secondly, he absolutely did all the things Samuel warned about. He conscripted the men of Israel so that every 4 months, these men had to go and build the temple. Now you might think, well, they're building a temple to God. That's not so bad. And this is true, except, what do you know? Solomon's palace is adjacent to God's temple. So, wow, the temple's finished, but you got to keep working on my palace. That's a different story. Having to go build God's temple is one thing. That's a holy thing to be doing, and that's a holy sacrifice. Building this joker's temple, a palace? Say what? I'm neglecting my fields and my family to build your palace? I don't think so. So he scandalized the pious, and he's conscripted people for his own luxury. Only out of deference to David does the kingdom stay together until he dies, and then boom, his son refuses to listen to the elder statesmen who say, you know what, Solomon was doing it wrong. Change the policies and the kingdom will stay together. And all his young snotty friends say, no, this is a great idea. We'll all make lots of money off these people. And they can keep conscripting them. This is great. He goes, yeah, I like power, money too. We'll keep conscripting them. 10 of the tribes said, toodles, out of here. We're going to make our own kingdom. And they became the Kingdom of Israel, known also as the Northern Kingdom. And to be super confusing, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin made the Kingdom of Judah. So you have the Kingdom of Israel, Kingdom of Judah. Very confusing. But that's what happened. And that was roughly about 922 BCE. So again, the tribes just are having trouble making it work. And it is, again, because of power abusing. And one thing I think we don't always realize, all of us have power. Every human being, no matter how powerless you might feel, we all have power. All of us, whether it's the power to say something nasty to someone, to go be a little kid at school and punch someone, some other little kid, or laugh at them, or, we all have power. And we all misuse it from time, sometimes. We all do. And when the more power you have, the more ability or risk you have of misusing that power. And when you have unlimited power, I can't even imagine what that would be like. Because then you become so distant from the average person that you can't even imagine what their lives are like anymore. You can't even imagine that such people even exist anymore. Or that you lose empathy because no one around you expects you to be empathetic. I'll never forget one time I had a neighbor who worked for Microsoft. And he used to live in Seattle and lived and worked for Microsoft. And he said, one time I was really lucky. I was working on this project. So they let me go to this party and Bill Gates was there. I said, what was he like? And he said, well, I was in the middle of talking to him and he just wandered away. I said, that was really rude. And he said, well, he's an important guy and I wasn't very important. And so he just got bored with what I said and walked away. And I said, but he has no right to treat you that way. And he said, Now, I've heard different things about Bill Gates's personality and whether he's on the neurodivergent spectrum. But I think everyone, and so not to pick on Bill Gates per se, but I think that the whole concept that anyone with that much power is permitted to treat other people that way. As another example that maybe is more to the point, my uncle was a priest, and he told me this story that in the 80s, one of his parishioners was a young man who was dying of AIDS. And so he would go and visit this gentleman and basically was with him when he died. And it turned out that this young man was from a very, very wealthy family. So his father, who had not rejected his son, but I think was more afraid to go and be with his son when he died, invited my uncle as a thank you for taking such nice care of his son. As a thank you, asked my uncle to come to New York for a nice weekend. And so the guy flew my uncle out first class to New York and put him up in a very nice hotel and took him out to dinner. And I think first they had a limo ride, but then for some reason they were going back to the hotel, and they took a cab. And as soon, everywhere they went, this man tipped, and everyone knew who he was. Oh, thank you, Mr. So-and-so. Thank you, Mr. So-and-so. And then when they got back to my uncle's hotel, and they were leaving the cab, this man didn't tip the cab driver. So my uncle just thought, oh, he's out of cash. And so my uncle pulled out his wallet to tip this man. And the guy said, no, don't tip him. We're never going to see that SOB again. He can't give us anything. Let's just leave. And he dragged my uncle out of the cab. So this man wasn't generous because he was generous. He was generous at all the places where people knew him, where they would say, oh, welcome, Mr. So-and-so, and can I take your coat, Mr. So-and-so, and let's put you at the best table, Mr. So-and-so. That's the only reason he handed out $100 bills. But when it was a cab driver he was never going to see again, he didn't give that man a nickel. And nor would he allow my uncle to, because my uncle was still ready to do it, and he grabbed my uncle and dragged him out in the street. And my uncle was just so appalled he couldn't move, right? And the guy drove off. That's someone who has lost empathy. It wouldn't have killed that guy to give him $100 to that cab driver, but he had no intention of doing that. And he had no empathy for someone who couldn't do something back for him. And so when you have David and Solomon and these kings, and I don't know if it was a personality issue with Bill Gates, or if it's his lack of empathy because he is Bill Gates, or a combination of both. I don't want to judge him. But you get the idea that when someone is a billionaire, they don't have to treat people nicely if they don't feel like it. And they get to a point where they don't notice. And so again, I don't want to pick particularly on Bill Gates, but I will pick on that other gentleman. I'm not going to judge him, but I'm going to judge his actions. It's that whole corruption of power, because he could. And every one of us has power of some sort, And we have to be both aware we have power and be gentle with it, be cautious with it. Because we all can abuse our power. And David and Solomon abused their power. And God is the one who gives us all our power. And God asks us to be good stewards of our power. And in the end, the tribes of Israel couldn't get along. They made 2 kingdoms, and they made messes of their kingdoms. All we hear in the book of Kings, after the splitting of the kingdoms recounted and went into Chronicles, are over and over. There was this king and he did evil, and there was this king and he did evil, and these people overthrew that person, and these people overthrew that person, and on and on and on, until in 722 BCE, the Assyrians from Mesopotamia came and they destroyed the kingdom of Israel, and they made a vassal state of the kingdom of Judah, and they took the Israelites who were living in the kingdom of Israel, and they distributed tons of them into parts of their empire. They scattered them, and then they imported people from various parts of their empire into what was left of the kingdom of Israel, which is a pretty good way to destroy a culture. And so the people who were exported are often known as the lost tribes of Israel, because no one knows where those people went. They assimilated into whatever culture they were exported to. And the Israelites who were left in the northern kingdom intermarried with the people the Assyrians imported into their kingdom from other parts of the empire. And their descendants became known as the Samaritans. In 538, or 5, have my dates mixed up, 587 BCE, the Babylonians, who took over the Assyrian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar, destroyed the kingdom of Judah, destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the Ark of the Covenant, sorry Indiana Jones fans, and destroyed Solomon's temple, and took everyone who was anyone, the last king. Nebuchadnezzar slaughtered all his sons and then blinded him, so the last thing he would have ever seen was the murder of his sons. Took the last king, Hezekiah, to exile in Babylon, took the rest of priests, aristocracy, artisans, took them all into exile in Babylon. It's still known as the exile. It was traumatizing to the Israelite people, to the point where after the exile, they became known as Jews. The whole face of their religion and culture changed so dramatically. They changed the name of the people. They were no longer Yahweh worshipers. They became Jews who worship God. I mean, that's how devastating this event was for the people and the culture and their understanding of God. And the exile lasted until 537 BCE, when Cyrus the Persian took over the Babylonian Empire. And the book of Chronicles again relays all these events of kings and overthrowings and the ending of the northern kingdom of Israel, the ending of the kingdom of Judah, the exile, and the last portion of the book of Chronicles is the return. Cyrus the Persian telling the Jewish people, you may now return to the land of Israel, to Judah, to Jerusalem. And so you can see why in the Tanakh they end the Bible with that. Because that is salvation. That is reconciliation. That is God's promise. You return to your land. You return to your home. You are saved. And throughout the prophets and the Psalms, we will always hear them talking about the remnant of Israel, who are these people who survived in Babylon and were able to come back to the land. So again, while we have a God who is not in a hurry, and I know I said that last time, and it's one of the most, I personally find it one of the most frustrating aspects of God, right? It took 4 billion years to get here. And it took me 57 years to get here. Gosh darn it, I would have liked to get this knowledgeable and wise and comfortable in my skin, as they say. I hate using cliches, but comfortable in myself and comfortable in my life. I'd have liked it to take a heck of a lot less time than 57 years to get here. Jeez Louise. Come on, God. You could do things a little quicker. You're God. But we have a God who's not in a hurry. And what our faith is that God does act. And that God is always acting. Sometimes where we can't see. And sometimes God is not giving us yes or no. God frustratingly is giving us, hold on, just be patient. The good is on its way. You're safe right now. I've got you. Holding on to you. We're getting through this. And I think what we always, especially, 2020, what a year. Where was God? The answer, I was holding on to you. I am holding on to you. We're going to get through this. And I know it seems long to you, but we're getting through this together. And all these awful stories that sound awful to us, because history is awful, there's awful things always going on, is God's reassurance. We're gonna get through this together. Because never, ever, ever does God abandon us. Thank you.